Today we're going to talk on a subject that I spoke about, or I made reference to several weeks ago. And the response was the deciding factor that we should talk about it again. And I've entitled our lesson, Why the Suffering? Why the Suffering? And it's one of the most difficult questions that we all have to deal with, is why the suffering that we see in our world, or perhaps have experienced in our world. And when I respond to you on the subject, it might be helpful if I take a moment to point out to you what my role is, and actually what the role of Dorothy or Tom or any of our teachers or unity ministers is. And that is, I speak to you as a spiritual scientist, as a mind scientist. I am not a theologian. I have dedicated, as all of our leaders do, many, many years to studying what are the principles of mind action or spiritual action in our universe. And when you do this, you sometimes approach a subject out of your own years of dedication without some of the support material that is needed. For instance, let's suppose that you went to visit an astrophysicist. And this is before anybody had ever been on the moon. And you were talking to him about the possibility of somebody being on the moon. And you said to him, well, you mean somebody could be on the moon? The moon's shining up there tonight, it's over there. And he said, that's right. He said, we could blast a rocket off, and he points over in this direction. And you say, wait a minute. Why are you pointing there? The moon's over here. And he said, well, to put the rocket on the moon, you have to fire off in this direction. And you say, now, wait a minute, you got to hit what you're shooting at, you've got to aim at it. And he said, oh, no, you see, and then he might tell you that certain principles that deal with space and geometry and these things, and say, well, this tells us you have to shoot off this way. And you would say, you could say, shrug your shoulders and go out and say, we'll never get anything on the moon with his methods. But of course, once somebody's on the moon, you say, well, he didn't know what he was talking about, didn't he? Well, when we talk about some of these things, such as why the human suffering, our responses as spiritual scientists are sometimes very difficult for people to accept. And I understand that. We say, as spiritual scientists, that all human suffering is self-imposed. I used a language that perhaps was not the best choice of words several weeks back, and I said that we all earn everything we get. And I made that in reference to some, in quotes, suffering experience in our life. And in hindsight, I realized when we use the word earn, we quite often think of something like our Cub Scout friend who got his award. He worked for it and he got an award, something positive and good. So saying that you earn your suffering was perhaps a little difficult to take, and so it's easier to say something you all can accept much better, and say it's self-inflicted. That is, your suffering is self-inflicted rather than earned. Do you like that better? Somebody says very honestly, no. We say this based on a principle that God is everywhere present, universal mind. There is nothing that does not have its existence within God. We say that we discern that the nature of God is absolute good. On that premise, there is no possibility for suffering in terms of reality. The system was not created for suffering. If we went back to our position where someone said, okay, but now we're right back where we were. I said, what causes the suffering then? You tell me that God hasn't caused it, only God, where does it come from? And our answer to that is that it comes from the person's ability to experience what he thinks, which is a mark of his divinity. That God has so fashioned us that we can experience what we think. When we choose to think suffering thoughts We experience suffering even though there is no support for it or reality in the system that is around us. Now, where people struggle with this the most is like someone who heard this lesson at the first service and who's been in metaphysics some time. But going out, they said to me, and again I could feel the emotion in their voice, they said, "You mean to say that the people at Linden have not suffered?" And that's where some of the flooding has taken place. And I said, I have not inferred in any way, that we as scientists say, that there was not an experience that has challenged people. But we say whether they have suffered or not is an individual matter. And as a scientist, I can prove that to you. That is, I can put people up here who have gone through it, and they will say to you, I'm not happy at all with the fact that I've lost my home and lost this, but I'm as happy as the day before as far as my sense of well-being is with my life. I'm not suffering because I know I'll deal with this. I'd rather I didn't have to deal with it, but I'll deal with it. And then I can put someone else up there and say, my life is over. I've worked for 30 years. I've heard people say this on television, and as I hear them, my blessing power just go on to work and say, don't believe it, don't believe it. You can start over. You can turn it upside down. You can make this the biggest, best turning point in your life. How do I know that? Because I've witnessed it in life after life, and I've witnessed it myself. I've suffered, folks. Have I suffered? And I say that, and I perhaps listen to that, but I mean it. Psychologically, I've suffered as bad as anyone in this room. But God didn't make me suffer. And the condition I could tell you about didn't make me suffer. Because I have minister brothers who've gone through the same thing I did, and they didn't suffer. Well, they had as much reason. But I didn't know better when I was suffering. That's the difference. And I also know, as a scientist, that I'm in good company. Because I know this is what, first of all, I'm convicted this is what Jesus was trying to say to us. And then you add such marvelous minds as Emerson and Thoreau and Charles Fillmore, and many of our greatest thinkers who are also scientists who agree to the same thing. It's beginning to come in wonderful ways now. It's beginning to show up in things like someone gave me a tape to enjoy recently by one of the founders of the Amway Corporation. Many of you are familiar with that company. And I was listening to it, and he was telling the story of how when he was a little boy, his parents went through the Depression, which means they all went through the Depression. And he said, we were poor. We were so poor, he said, I remember one occasion a beautiful child like me came by signing a subscription. They wanted 10 cents for that year subscription. Anybody remember back when it was 10 cents for anything? Anyway, it was 10 cents for a subscription, and my parents looked and said, they didn't have 10 cents. And he said, the biggest day in our life is Saturday. Each one of the kids got a penny. But he said, my dad went for years without a steady job. But he said, my dad never changed his attitude about the fact that life was good. And he was totally positive all the time and radiated it to us kids. Kept telling us everything was going to be okay. And so far as we were concerned, life was great. You heard Dorothy in one of her lessons one time. A couple times I've heard her say that. She didn't have much money, she said, when she was little, but she didn't know any different, so she had a ball. So in any event, people listening to our friend at Amway and many other organizations are beginning to get the message in an area that they can better receive it. I think it's easier for people to generally say, yeah, that's right, you don't have to have money to be happy. And yet we know people who allow it to destroy themselves. They suffer. They wake up every morning thinking that somebody has more money than they have, therefore they're unhappy. And yet there are other people who don't have a thing. And they're happy, happy, happy. But then when you relate it to things like physical pain, it gets more difficult to understand this, and you have to research it more to be sure of your tenet. And when you have the privilege of being in the role that I have had, to stand with people who have gone through illnesses, some leading to the process of death, and you have known that they've had the same basic physical challenge, And you have seen one who moves through it all with an incredible state of ease and a radiant spirit. And you hear the nurse, when you make comments to the nurse about this person, and you say you're coming to see so-and-so, and they say, oh, yeah, they're marvelous. And you talk to them, you find out they say they should be suffering. They're basing that on what the symptoms are and what other people have done. And you say, they're just wonderful. They make us all feel happy. And then I know others that I visited where in that little dialogue they say, we don't know why they're so uncomfortable and pain. We've done everything we can. And the doctor said there's no reason for it. And you begin to realize that the scope of even physical pain is what's happening within ourselves. And again, I think Jack Schwartz, thank you. Jack Schwartz is a marvelous evidence, and as many of you have already proclaimed, what I can do, you can do. And he totally controls his pain by taking a certain set of attitude in mind. But that's more difficult for most of us to deal with. And then we have the questions, of course, of dying. And someone says, well, I mean, you can't say that's not suffering to die, but you can when you realize the principle of truth about all of us is we are spiritual beings. We do not die. We move from room to room. We put down our bodies. And how we do that, again, depends upon us. And, of course, then someone said, but now, but there is nothing but something when you lose someone you really love. But that's not true either. It depends on how you react to what has happened and in that loss. As difficult as it is, it always comes back to what you and I respond to, and there is no, and this is the power of our divinity, there is no one who is insisting that you have to respond to any situation in life from a suffering consciousness. Sometimes we feel the power of people around us, and I've had people say this to me, my biggest problem is everybody thinks I should be grieving. And I don't feel like grieving. I feel my loved one wanted to be free, needed to be free, and I believe God has a good plan for me. And yet I know that people are looking at me and say, what is wrong with her? Didn't she love him? So anytime we do have to fight against that current, but in the final analysis, you and I choose all of our responses. Well, now, as a scientist, I say to you, that's a hard truth. That is the truth. Just like you can't get to the moon by shooting at it, you got to shoot out there. Whether you like it or not, whether you respond to that emotion or not, rightly, it's true. You got to hit it by going at it in a different direction. Today, I want to add to this scientific principle by creating a story for you. It's a story that's meant a great deal to me, and I have used it at times in my own life. Not this exact whole story I'm giving you, but general scenario. I have used it when I found myself being overwhelmed by images of my suffering, perhaps, or your suffering. I want you to imagine with me, just let your mind go with this now. Imagine that you're going to visit a magnificent theater. You walk into this theater, and it's immense. And before you, as you come in as a stage, it's so big that it's just mind-blowing. It's monstrous stage. And already this play is in action. And as you look at the stage, you realize that there are persons on the stage who look like ordinary people, and they seem to be involved in many of the aspects of normal life as you are used to seeing it. But they're all acting up a storm. I mean, everyone's busy on that stage doing this thing, acting this thing. Some are by themselves. I mean, maybe they're out watering. Some are going up and down a little lawn they've created here, and they're sitting on this huge stage. Others are in groups. Some seem to be sitting, listening to someone talk, and they're shaking their head or yes or whatever. And others are involved in good situations where there's a great deal of patience. Occasionally you see some sitting by themselves, and they're just caught up in a very emotional expression of sorrow or of suffering. Some are fighting. Some in the stage of fighting. Some are loving. All the various scenarios that you've ever seen in life are going on, acting on this stage. Some people are dying. And you know this, as you see these people acting out on the stage, and you see this person acting the dying process, that as they're going through this, if they really get themselves into acting out this process of dying, as you have seen it before, and you realize that's what they're acting out, suddenly from this actor comes this sort of golden figure, light flow figure would be a better way to describe it, and it just sort of takes off and disappears. And all that is left is the costume they were wearing. And some people usually come along and they open a hole in the stage and drop the costume down, and sometimes all around that hole people are just crying their head off. And other times, people just gather for a moment and seem to have a sort of a celebration kind of experience, and then they go off about their business. But the fact that you have seen this, and you've seen these figures take off as light flow figures, draws your attention away from the stage, which has totally captivated you now, and suddenly you realize you can also see stage. And off stage, there are, you just can't count the number of light flow beings that seem to be there. And as you're aware that they're sort of standing around there as action on the stage, you see that every once in a while, one of those light flow beings comes back on stage. And where they come, they suddenly, their light goes off, and they're in costume again. And this time they're in a little baby costume. And the group seems generally, they pop up in a group, and the people seem to enjoy seeing them there. That is just so overwhelming in this magnificent fairy setting. Seems, as you observe it more, to be totally chaotic and unconnected. And you think to yourself, I got to figure out what is this all about? And so you go up behind stage and you ask for the director. You meet the director and you're very impressed with the power and the authority of the director. And you ask him, what's going on here? And the director says to you, this is a self-realization theater. All the actors that are involved and actresses, they're all in the process of endeavoring to discover themselves. And the process of acting out on the stage gives them a background in which they can eventually find what their true being and potential for being is. The significance of this special theater, the director tells us, is that they actually can make anything they want happen. They can create any scene they want in a part of this process of discovering themselves. The director then says, I try to help them in this process of self-discovery by cueing them from off stage. But I must share with you that I have difficulty with this because they all have the same tendency. The minute they're on stage, they get carried away with the action, and we don't listen. But the key is always there for anyone who wants to listen. They've all been told, he says, but they don't all listen. Now you go back out to your suit, and you feel like, well, I can get a grasp of this thing now, and you begin to observe more carefully, and you notice that as the new ones, the light flow ones come and they suddenly take on this new costume as a baby, you notice that they grow and they get bigger like everyone else on the stage, but you also notice that they tend to act very much along the lines of the group they start with. They tend to follow the guidance of the other group. But every once in a while, you see one of them break away from the group, especially those who seem to take time to listen. And you can tell in your suit when they're listening to the cues. And it seems that when they hear the cue, they quite often will make changes in their life. And that often will mean a change of group gathering and of the scenarios that they choose to act out. You also notice that some of the people that are acting are doing things that are really quite challenging to others on the stage. Some act out animosity, and they find others who want to act animosity too, and pretty soon the two of them are fighting and dragging in a lot of people with them. You also are captivated that every once in a while on this mammoth stage, a tremendous personality seems to arise, a great actor. And you notice in one, for instance, that he's acting out a scenario that everybody else on the stage isn't as good as he is. Because the skin isn't the same color. or they were born in the same country. And this person's so dramatic, he captures the attention of all the other actors, and they're right with them, they're screaming and they're hollering, and boy, they'll start to get everybody involved on the stage. And then that gets all quieted down, and people shuffle in another direction. You notice that some build machines. They get busy interacting, they build some machines, and they get these machines going, and these machines don't work right. They fall down upon the people, and the people then act out what it's like to have something fall on you in that stage setting, and they seem to suffer. You notice, too, that some choose to have their meetings and to live, so to speak, act out this scenario on the stage, where the stage director long before built a volcano. You scratch your head and you wonder, why do they keep living by that volcano? Because every once in a while it bubbles out and all the actors, carry on because it's awful, and they suffer a great deal as they deal this. Some even choose to live by a water that runs on the stage. It's like the MGM Theater up in... Every once in a while that water flows over. Others choose not to live there, or others choose to build ways of protecting themselves. But all this is going on all the time. And every once in a while, we're suffering because of the situation. But some people going through the same experience sort of shake it off, and they go and join another group who are all smiles. And you realize, well, that's what that actor chose to do. Others like to stay, and they just seem to be enjoying themselves so much. They pound their chest because that's what they feel is their pathway to finding themselves, because they're all trying to find themselves. And as I said, not too many are hearing the truth. Now, the director, you go back and visit the director one more time. And the director says, everyone is capable of holding his own role. But if you'll notice on the stage that part of the major trouble is that everybody is being influenced by everyone else, and they are not taking the path that I have told them to take, which is to try to do that which is most natural to their being. And that's what I keep cueing them in for, to do what comes naturally. And he says, if you'll notice, so many of them seem to respond to those who cry the loudest and who seem to need the help and who suffer the most. And they take that cue, and that becomes their acting role too. But what I'm trying to cue them to is that if they will do what is really natural to them, in the process, they will find their own happiness and potential, and they'll influence those other people. And then those actors will start acting that way too, then they'll have discovered themselves. Well, you go back to your seat now. And you're observing this and appreciating the subtleties of it all, and the magnificent way in which everyone can act just what he wants to act. But you also find, as you keep realizing, that most of the people on the stage are suffering. That's the role they're playing. Some degree of suffering and unhappiness. You realize it's getting overwhelming, and your thoughts suddenly comes, how does the director deal with this? Because most of them seem to be suffering all the time. So you go back to the director one more time, and you say, how do you deal with this? And the director says, well, first of all, in my mind, you see, I know I wrote the real script. And I know the beginning, and I know the ending. And I know it's going to turn out okay. Secondly, I know that, as I said, this is a self-realization theater. And therefore, I know how it's going to turn out, but I have to give all the actors the freedom to act until they find the right role. The one that I told you is the happy, joyful one. And then that will bring them to the conclusion of the script that I've already written. And thirdly, I also make sure that their suffering is never more than they can bear. Because if you'll notice, when some have suffered enough, they seem to reach a point where they suddenly change their role. But if they don't, then I built this in to the programming of this performance, and that is that I'll get them off stage. And I do that by the way in which, as you noticed, they die. They act the role of dying. And as soon as I get them off stage, as you can see, I revive them. You go back to your seat now for the last time. Gagawin ko itong video.